Ever since the fall of communism in Eastern Europe, analysts have been wondering about North Korea. Might the DPRK be next? Might the Kim regime fall as suddenly and spectacularly as the Berlin Wall, leading to German-style reunification with the South? It's a question that seemed most urgent in the 1990s when Kim Il-sung died and the Hermit Kingdom plunged into a devastating famine. But it resurfaced when Kim Jong-un took power in 2011 and has since been trotted out like clockwork every time Pyongyang suffers a crisis. This happened to the extent that it's almost become a bit of a cliche. But as the saying goes, even a stopped clock is right twice a day. Following reports in late June that the country is suffering a renewed famine, analysts are again wondering if regime implosion might be on the cards. So, well, now seems as good a time as any to give the question the warographics treatment and not only weigh the likelihood of an imminent DPRK collapse, but explore what that would mean at any time. To really get into the weeds of what the end of Kim's dictatorship might really look like. Because, as we're about to see, no matter when it happens, a North Korean collapse would shake the entire world. It was one of the worst famines of the post-World War II era. In the mid-1990s, North Korea was nearly obliterated by a tidal wave of hunger that swept its provinces. From a total population of 20 million, it's thought starvation carried away between 500,000 to 2 million lives. Per capita, that's a staggering death toll, especially when you consider it per capita. It's far, far higher than even the worst affected countries in the recent COVID pandemic. And since then, famine has been a spectre that haunts Pyongyang's elites, haunts too outside coverage of the isolated state. If you even vaguely follow news related to North Korea, you've probably seen claims of renewed famine dozens of times, such as the rash of reporting in 2013 that claimed citizens were being forced into cannibalism. In most of these cases, these reports tend to be a mixture of exaggeration and just outright fabrication, a side effect of information inside the Hermit Kingdom being hard to access and defectors wanting to paint the situation in as bad a light as possible. So when rumors started swirling this spring that starvation was again stalking the land, most analysts took them with a good old pinch of salt. I mean, after all, we'd been here before. Yet as 2023 ground on, hints of supporting evidence began to emerge. The statement by South Korean officials in March that deaths from starvation were occurring in the north. The data from North Korean monitoring website Rimjingang, which showed staple foods trading at above normal prices. But it was a blockbuster report in June that really brought the issue to the world's attention. Over months of diligent reporting, a team from the BBC had managed to interview 3 ordinary people living in different parts of the country. The stories they told pointed toward a nation undergoing its worst food crisis since the 1990s. There was the woman living in the elite city of Pyongyang who described how a family of 3 had starved to death in her apartment block, the construction worker up near the Chinese border who couldn't even remember the last time he'd received his state rations. The last part here is important as the North Korean state controls the food supply. When the system is working, all workers in the country receive rations they can supplement with goods purchased in markets. The fact state rations have disappeared, at least in some places, would indicate that the government simply doesn't have enough food to go around. This is backed up by a UN report which recently estimated the DPRK barely has enough food for 3/4 of its citizens. As the BBC's in-depth report attested, the knock-on effects are already being felt. Their Pyongyang interviewee described starving people taking their own lives or leaving the city for the wilderness to die in solitude. Another, meanwhile, talked about being forced to eat puljuk for a week, a mixture of grass and plants mixed with veg into a thin paste associated with the 1990s famine. Other outlets have told similar stories. Rimjingang reports an increase in robberies and violent crime by desperate people. The Korea Herald, meanwhile, has run stories alleging cannibalism. Now, we should be clear. The situation isn't necessarily the same today as it was back in June. South Korea's unification minister reported in July that food prices in the Hermit Kingdom have since stabilized, despite reports of starvation remaining widespread. Still, with an estimated 40% of the North Korean population already suffering malnutrition, any form of food insecurity has the potential to be absolutely catastrophic. And that in turn could be a catastrophe for the guys running things. You see, part of Kim Jong-un's unspoken contract is that he'll keep the elites and military shielded from deprivation in return for them letting his regime continue. People might suffer in the countryside and in the small towns, but residents of the cities are meant to be protected from the worst. But If Pyongyang's middle-class citizens are starving, then this contract could be fraying. If it snaps completely, then the regime could quickly find itself in trouble. As one of the BBC's interviewees put it, before COVID, people viewed Kim Jong-un positively. Now, almost everyone is full of discontent. It's this brewing discontent that could, one day, perhaps soon, bring the North Korean state crashing down. So, before we get on to exploring how a North Korean collapse might play out, we first need to explain how things got so bad in the first place. Because, make no mistake, the Hermit Kingdom's current dysfunction is not the inevitable result of decades of mismanagement. It's due to concrete, recent choices made on the regime's part. Choices that took a poor but surviving state and turned it into one on the brink of starvation. The biggest choice of all, Pyongyang's reaction to COVID. Back in early 2020, North Korea was one of the first nations to implement the sort of controls that would all soon be forced to live with. That January, Pyongyang sealed its borders. No one was allowed in, including its own overseas workers and vehicles bringing goods. But while most countries would eventually create workarounds for receiving imports and repatriating citizens from abroad, the DPRK was seemingly content to cut itself off from the outside world forever. From January 2020 till summer of 2023, it's thought only a single person successfully entered North Korea, a Chinese diplomat assigned to Pyongyang. Apart from that, the borders have remained sealed. And that's had a devastating impact on food security. With no vehicles allowed in from China, imports completely stopped, not just of vital grain supplies, but of farm equipment and of fertilizers. At the same time, the BBC reports that leaving has become impossible. While those living near the Chinese border used to surreptitiously cross to bring back food to sell in black markets, the guards they once bribed now just shoot them on sight. Informal markets are what have kept most North Koreans fed for decades. Emerging in the 1990s, they were, for a long time, tolerated by the state as a guardrail against starvation. Now, though, they stand empty, testimony to the brand new walls and watchtowers Pyongyang has built along the border with China. Walls designed not to keep foreigners out, but to keep their own people trapped inside. The result has been a surge in black market food prices, even as government rations dry up. To illustrate, one interviewee told the BBC that his daily wage of 50 cents was no longer enough to afford a kilo of rice, a figure that gets even more grotesque when you remember what the Kim regime spends on weapons. In 2022, Pyongyang's combined missile tests are thought to have cost around $500 million, a figure that could easily purchase enough grain on international markets to ease the food crisis. Again, it's worth noting here that things may have improved slightly in the last month. Although the pandemic measures remain in place, grain is once again being imported from China, enough to at least stabilize the food prices. But these imports still aren't enough to alleviate the suffering of North Korean citizens. And that might be by design. Rather than an ill-thought-out reaction to the spread of COVID-19, there's evidence the border closures are part of a conscious effort by Kim to increase his control over the country. Writing in NK News, career analyst Chad O'Carroll outlines the ways the regime has grown even more autocratic over the last few years. After his 2019 summit with Donald Trump failed to bring the results Kim wanted, Pyongyang seems to have pivoted back to an even more extreme version of its previous isolation. This includes a crackdown on South Korean shows and music. Passed in 2020, the Reactionary Ideology and Culture Rejection Act mandated new penalties for anyone smuggling South Korean media. Before, smugglers caught selling these shows could expect a fine and a year in prison. Since 2020, the punishment has been execution. And it's here that we can see what Kim really fears. And it's not COVID-19. For decades, Pyongyang has told its citizens that they live in the greatest country in the world, but South Korean shows challenge that, depicting not a collapsing vassal state of America, but a rich, technologically advanced society that's just over the border. Clearly, the regime believes these images weaken its hold over the population. Slamming the borders completely shut under the guise of the pandemic was a crude way of strengthening that hold. Even this, though, doesn't touch on the darkest part of it all, the theory that these border closures may not just be about ideological purity, but a means of ensuring no one will ever be strong enough to rise up against Kim's regime. When discussing a personalized authoritarian regime like North Korea, the thing you have to bear in mind is that the government doesn't exist to do what's best for the country. It exists to do whatever is best for the regime, even if what's best for the dictator and his chums might be an utter disaster for the nation. To illustrate, let's look quickly at another personalized authoritarian regime, Russia. During the Ukraine war, Russian military high command has made gobsmacking strategic errors. The spring 2023 offensive around Avdiivka, for example, was marked by tanks repeatedly being driven headlong into withering Ukrainian fire and being destroyed. Yet, even after such breathtaking displays of incompetence, Valery Gerasimov remained overall theater commander, not because he was useful to Russia, but because he was loyal to Putin, and in a personalized regime, being a pawn of the leader is more valuable than, basic competence. Well, North Korea is far more authoritarian and far more personalized than even Putin's Russia. As a result, the regime is more willing to sabotage its own nation to remain at the top. Remember those informal markets that we mentioned earlier? While they kept ordinary North Koreans fed, they also created a middle class of traders and smugglers. For the nation as a whole, this newly prosperous merchant class was a net win. Had it been allowed to flourish, it might have lifted thousands or even millions of people out of dire poverty. But as analyst Lucas Rengifo-Keller told CNN, quote, "The regime does not want a flourishing entrepreneurial class that can threaten its power." In other words, Kim weighed up his ongoing rule against that whole lifting millions out of poverty thing and basically thought, you know what, my cheese addiction is absolutely more important than your suffering, peasant. NK News reached a similar conclusion in a long, detailed article about the impact of prolonged border closures. Describing the ability of North Koreans to compare their lot against their neighbors as, quote, Kim Jong-un's Achilles heel, the piece argued that the sealed borders are a net win for the regime, even if the price of that win is objectively horrific. Or as the article put it, to quote, "With no major NGO or UN aid, living conditions for many will continue to deteriorate. Chronic food and medical supply shortages could become more acute, leading to increased malnutrition and poor health outcomes. But the regime itself will benefit, tightening its grip on power despite the immiseration of its people." The grimmest part is that in many ways the existence of widespread starvation might actually even help with this. As more people grow desperate and denounce their neighbors for illegally buying or hoarding food, the whole of society plunges into paranoia. Perversely, that means everyone spends more time worrying about those closest to them and less about the regime that's responsible for their misery. To quote the BBC's investigation one final time today, this erosion of trust concerns Professor Andrei Lankov, who has been studying North Korea for 40 years. If people don't trust each other, there is no starting point for resistance, he says. What that means is North Korea can stabilize and last for years and decades to come. This chapter of today's video then basically serves as a counterweight to our opening premise, a reality check that even if things get extremely bad in the DPRK, Kim and his cronies may manage to lumber on for decades to come, sacrificing the lives and the well-being of 26 million people just to keep one tubby tyrant and a handful of generals in their state of unearned luxury. But let's not dwell too much on this. Instead, let's pretend for a second that the end does come, that it turns out this latest famine really is the catalyst for change in North Korea, that the Kim regime at last collapses. The key question then is what comes next. What does a post-Kim North Korea even look like? Depending on who you talk to, the answer to that question could be anything from chaotic but hopeful to a nightmare for the entire world. One of the interesting things about doing a video on the collapse of North Korea is that your research will turn up tons of paper on the subject from years and years ago. For instance, we found a Brookings Institute transcript of a 2003 guest lecture by Richard C. Bush on the topic. The most interesting part, despite being a full decade old, many of the points he made are still totally relevant today. In particular, Bush outlined a framework for the ways the Kim regime might conceivably fall. He organized it into 3 categories, which he called Type 1, Type 2, or Type 3 collapses. These neatly illustrate the different challenges and dangers DPRK upheaval could bring. The first one is also the one that the world would notice the least. A Type 1 collapse is what Bush calls essentially a coup, basically a move by some of Kim's generals to liquidate the ruling family but otherwise leave the North Korean system intact. For those of us sat in Europe or America, this sort of collapse would probably be a blink and miss it affair, a kind of anticlimax not dissimilar to the 2017 coup against Robert Mugabe, in which Zimbabwe's military swapped out one dictator for another. Unfortunately, Unfortunately, though, such a disappointing end to Kim might be the best that we can hope for. If Richard Bush is right, the alternatives would be much worse. Of these potential nightmares, a Type 2 collapse would be the least bad, least there very much being a question of degree. In this scenario, one faction might lead a coup and remove or kill Kim, but then fail to get the rest of the military lining up behind them. The result would be two factions with mutually exclusive claims on power, claims they can only solve by launching a bitter civil war. An analogy here might be the current situation in Sudan. There, a series of military coups briefly led to stability before cracks began to emerge, cracks that earlier this year split into ongoing warfare between the two sides. Finally, we get to a Type 3 collapse, or what we might term the Libya model. In this scenario, North Korea essentially disintegrates. There's a multifaceted civil conflict that rips the nation to shreds and drags on indefinitely. By the end, the DPRK has ceased to exist. Now, it's possible to argue that Bush is being too pessimistic. You'll notice there's no option marked revolution followed by eventual reunification with South Korea. In other words, a replay of what happened to East Germany. Still, these cynical scenarios are ones that we obviously have to take seriously, not least because they would undoubtedly drag the rest of the world in. As the Rand Corporation wrote in a paper around the time of Richard Bush's lecture, in the event of regime collapse in Pyongyang, quote, "The Republic of Korea, ROK, and its US ally will almost certainly need to intervene militarily in the north." To understand why that remains true even today, you need to only understand a single word: proliferation. North Korea, you see, is swimming with weapons of mass destruction. Weapons which could, in a Type 2 collapse, be used by one or both of the warring factions, or in a Type 3 scenario, simply vanish amid the chaos. This is the nightmare scenario for the world in which Pyongyang's nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons become untraceable wildcards. Hence why the US and South Korea will almost certainly need to intervene in any such scenario to secure those WMDs. Unfortunately, that's easier said than done. Back in 2022, the Arms Control Association estimated that North Korea is home to anywhere between 45 and 55 nuclear warheads. That's a mere fraction of the arsenals that the US, Russia, or China field. Nor are Pyongyang's nukes even remotely comparable in terms of yield or reliability. Nonetheless, the idea of roughly 50 nukes lying unsecured in a collapsing country is the stuff of absolute nightmares. And it's not just a Type 3 collapse that would make them dangerous. During Russia's recent Wagner rebellion, Reuters reported that a contingent of the mercenaries split off from the force advancing on Moscow and made a dash for Voronezh 45, a nuclear weapons storage site. Now, there's no suggestion that they breached the facility or would have been able to secure any WMDs even if they did so. Still, the fact that they immediately went for the nukes in the handful of hours that it looked like Russia might be tipping into civil war does not bode well for any conflict in North Korea. As former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev ominously put it of the rebellion, "In the history of mankind, there has never been a case where an arsenal of nuclear weapons was controlled by bandits. Such a crisis will obviously not be limited to the framework of one country." Yet nukes may not even be the greatest threat, given securing them quickly would be the main focus of any American-led intervention. Perhaps more worrisome are the DPRK's chemical and biological weapons. The Nuclear Threat Initiative reports that North Korea is home to 6 major sites where chemical weapons like mustard gas, sarin, and VX are stored. This includes up to 5,000 metric tons of nerve agents. According to Vox, North Korea's chemical arsenal, to quote, "is believed to be the biggest and most technologically advanced in the world." To give just some idea of its destructive power, military historian Reed Kirby gamed out in 2017 what would happen if Pyongyang dumped its entire sarin stockpile on Seoul. His answer was 2.5 million dead with another 7 million injured. Obviously, in a collapse scenario, the worry is less that Seoul will be targeted and more that warring factions in the north will use the weapons on each other. Regardless, Kirby's figures give some insight into just how deadly Kim's chemical stockpiles are. Unfortunately, the bioweapon stocks might be even worse. Kim has spent his decade plus in power hoarding some of the nastiest viruses and bacteria on Earth. Credible reports suggest that the DPRK cultivates everything from the plague to smallpox to anthrax to Ebola. If released, these could spread like wildfire through the population, potentially spilling over borders and triggering nightmare outbreaks in neighboring countries. The real fear, though, is the threat of a rogue actor smuggling some of this stuff out of North Korea, maybe to sell to others, maybe to use in a terrorist attack. 100 kilograms of anthrax, for example, would be enough to kill 3 million people and leave entire cities uninhabitable for generations. And while 100 kilograms is quite a lot to transport, far smaller amounts could still be devastating. A single backpack would be sufficient to take enough bioweapons to do untold destruction. So, yeah, you could probably see why most North Korea collapse scenarios keep Pentagon planners awake at night. However, it's worth pointing out that the US and South Korea wouldn't be alone in wanting to intervene and secure the Kim regime's weapons of mass destruction. There'd be another player in the mix, one that most Americans think of as their number one antagonist, a player called China. For a long time, China has been North Korea's only official ally. From Beijing's perspective, Pyongyang provides a useful buffer, a way of stopping US allies like South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and the Philippines from completely hemming it in. But that doesn't mean Xi Jinping is thrilled about having an unstable nuclear power right on his doorstep. Back in 2018, Foreign Affairs claimed that, quote, China is no longer wedded to North Korea's survival. In the event of a conflict or the regime's collapse, Chinese forces would intervene to a degree not previously expected, not to protect Beijing's supposed ally, but to secure its own interests. By which they meant a North Korean collapse wouldn't see China rushing to save Kim's flailing regime, but to stop the anarchy and to secure any WMDs as fast as possible. From a non-proliferation perspective, this is pretty good news. North Korea's most important nuclear facilities are all crouched up against the Chinese border, while a joint American-South Korean force would need to rapidly advance across some 400 kilometers of badly paved mountainous terrain. Chinese forces would only need to cover 96 kilometers to secure the same sites. Chances are they'd get there before any rogue actors did. The downside is that this would create an immediate dilemma for US forces trying to secure those same sites, plus related ones in other parts of the country. The options being cooperate and let China guard them, or try to carry out their original mission. The fear wouldn't be so much what Beijing would do with the WMDs. Xi Jinping has plenty of nukes already. Rather, it would be what China's presence means for a post-collapse North Korea. Washington and Seoul would be pushing to end the crisis by reunifying the peninsula under a democratic South Korean government. China obviously would prefer to keep a friendly buffer state on its doorstep. As a result, the aftermath of any intervention might wind up being the most fraught period of all. A period potentially as tense as the standoff between the USSR and Western allies, known as the Berlin Blockade, only with bigger stakes. For China, having an American-friendly leader in Pyongyang would be as unthinkable as a CCP-allied government setting up shop in Mexico for Washington. For South Korea, the idea of reunification would finally be within reach. A policy successive governments have worked towards for decades could finally become reality. For the US, it would be a chance to not just allow the North Korean self-determination, but also replace a belligerent threat with a new government on Washington's side. With so much riding on the outcome, tensions between Washington and Beijing could ratchet up, and there's no guarantee America would actually get its way. Speaking to Politico in 2023, South Korean pastor Kim Sung-gyeong, who has spent decades helping North Korean refugees, outlined his gut feelings for a collapse scenario. To quote, "My assumption, if they collapse, is the Chinese government is going to take over first. If they collapse right now, the Chinese will try to take over faster than anybody else. It'll only be when the moment actually comes that we'll get to see if he was right or not." At the end of all that, then, we hope we've given you some insight into both North Korea's current situation and the issues associated with the Kim regime collapse whenever it might happen. Certainly, it's been a bit depressing for us to research this. The thought that the best ordinary North Koreans can hope for is a fraught competition over their futures between America and China is hardly rosy. But then, that's often the reality of geopolitics. It can be grim, it can be depressing, but that doesn't mean we can ignore it. By planning now for what might happen next month, next year, or even decades down the line, we can ensure that when the time comes for the sun to finally set on Kim's carnival of horrors, we're prepared for any eventuality. In doing so, we give ourselves the best shot at securing an outcome that's good not only for us, but for the people of North Korea as well, the people who've suffered under their brutal leaders for far, far too long.